McKenzie. I'm delighted this afternoon to be hosting this special SEACEN webinar, which will be delivered by Stephen Scott from Starling Trust. I've just met Stephen a few minutes ago, and I've found him thus far to be a truly delightful and remarkable individual. He comes as a recognized expert in due diligence and risk management, and he has worked throughout the Americas, Asia, and Europe, where he has helped leaders in businesses and government to create, protect, and restore value and organizational integrity. This afternoon, we also have with us as well Glenn Taskey, the Director for Financial Stability and Supervision and Payments and Settlement System of the SEACEN Centre. I'm not going to take much of your time up in terms of house rules. We ask that you kindly mute your mics, just ensure that your speakers are on, that you're hearing us clearly. Please use the chat feature within the GoToMeeting software to let us know if you're not hearing us, and I will ask Stephen to just pause for a minute to make sure that we can rectify whatever issues you're having. For the question and answer session as well, please also use the chat feature and I will direct the questions to Stephen on your behalf. I've also shared my mobile number. You can send me WhatsApp messages. I'll monitor those as well for your questions and I'll direct them to Stephen on your behalf. Again, we're delighted to have Stephen here to share his experience around trust and technology, a new paradigm for culture and conduct risk management. Stephen, welcome to Kuala Lumpur. Welcome to the SEACEN Centre.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me just make sure, is this working properly? Are you hearing me? Okay, terrific. Well, again, thank you very much for the opportunity to address such a tremendous audience. I want to emphasize that I don't come from a background in bank supervision, and so I really benefit when folks who are listening in bring questions to me. So please don't hesitate to interrupt during the course of my remarks if anything I say is either unclear or triggers a thought for you that you'd like to ask something about. That's a great way for me to learn, and it's also an important way for me to make sure that I keep my comments most relevant to the interests of the audience. If I may, let me start with a little bit of an introduction to Starling. There we go. We talk about ourselves as an applied behavioral sciences technology company. And in brief, we build tools that firms in the financial services sector use in order to better gauge, manage, and mitigate culture and conduct related risks within their firms. This is, of course, of great interest to regulators today, and I'll say a bit more about that shortly, and we'll talk a little bit about our engagement with the regulatory community. Something else I want to emphasize is this is not a magic silver bullet that we've created. We're not replacing human judgment. Rather, we talk about our tools as augmenting risk intelligence. The simple fact is that machines have an ability to sift through data in far greater quantities and across a much larger scale than any human organization can do using just human beings. So we look to develop intelligence that then guides those who are responsible for risk governance and risk supervision with a view to uncovering where there's invisible systemic risks that may be of concern. Equally importantly is identifying opportunities to proactively engage to mitigate those risks, and then to gauge the efficacy of those interventions and to be able to do that in real time. I'll say a little bit more about all that as we go along. But to contextualize what we're doing in the financial services sector, I like to remind people that, back during the times of the great financial crisis, the narrative around the banking sector that the banks had all become too big to fail. What we hear more often today is that they're too big to manage. And that is a reason why it is argued we have so many culture and conduct related problems in the banking sector. It's a management challenge, it's a governance challenge. And so I'd like to posit my following remarks in that context. Mark Carney, back when he was speaking at in his role as the head of the FSB, made the observation in 2016 that the incidence of financial sector fraud and misconduct has risen to such a level that it actually becomes a prudential issue system-wide and creates systemic risks. Yep, sure. Excellent. Well, thank you for your patience as we work through some of these technical challenges. But to return to the thrust of this slide, this is something that all of you will clearly know given the work that you do. The level of misconduct in the financial sector has risen to a level back in 2016 and certainly increasingly so today, and worldwide, where the FSB has argued that it creates a systemic set of concerns because of an undermining of trust in institutions and in markets. That word trust is an important one for us. I'll return to it in a moment, but do keep that term in mind as we move forward. Great. So apologies once again for the delay on our side. We're trying to make sure that everyone can participate as intended, and a few of our participants are struggling with some technical issues.
You carry on.
But as I said, I'd come back to this term trust, and I'll do so again later. But for those of you who haven't seen it, if you have interest, we produce a report every year on the global regulatory agenda around culture and conduct risk in the banking sector. We produce this every spring. The current issue is available for download on our website, which is www.starlingtrust.com, if anyone has interest. But from the preamble of this year's report, we thought it was worth mentioning Greg Medcraft, the former head of the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, now the head of the Directorate for Financial and Enterprise Affairs, OECD. In the preamble to this year's report, he offered this comment on trust. And we couldn't agree more. Trust, or more importantly, the lack of it, has become a defining political, social, and economic feature of our time. Again, that's a concept I'd like to ask that people bear in mind as we go through the rest of our talk, because we think it's pretty fundamental to the work that we're doing. And I'll say a little bit later as to why that is. The banking sector has created its own industry body called the Operational Risk Exchange, or ORCS for short. They're an industry body where the heads of operational risk for the large banks in the world agree all to contribute operational risk loss data with one another, with a view to learning lessons from one another's experience and just keeping good industry aggregate figures. There are many industry figures out there that suggest that since the financial crisis, misconduct risk in the banking sector has resulted in over $200 billion in costs. I think this statistic is interesting because it's the industry's own statistic, and they've argued that actually the figure is $607 billion that banks have paid worldwide since the financial crisis to settle employee conduct risk violations. I think that sets the problem that we're working to solve into an important context. This is not just a priority for regulators of the banking sector, but it's a priority for the firms themselves. These costs just can no longer be absorbed. Shareholders have grown impatient with them. There's a real imperative on the part of banks to reduce their expenditure on governance, risk, and compliance related processes, systems, controls, personnel. But of course, they're reluctant to reduce investment in governance, risk, and compliance for fear that if something should go wrong in terms of a conduct issue, they'll be absolutely crucified by their regulators. And so there's a real, I think, convergence of interest between regulators of the banking sector and the firms themselves to try and come up with a better means of addressing these culture and conduct related problems. I'll just emphasize my own personal view. I think that creates a real window of opportunity for the regulatory officials, and for the banks to come together in common purpose and work together to come up with an industry standard means of addressing these issues. I'll say a little bit more about what regulators are doing in that regard shortly. John Williams at the New York Fed offered this view at the annual conference that the Fed holds on culture and conduct risk and reforming culture in the banking sector. Culture is at the center of every conversation, every decision, every action. And I think that that is a view that most regulators would agree with. the challenge, of course, is while we can all agree that culture is important, how do we operationalize governance of culture internally within firms? And then how do we create an effective means for supervising culture and conduct related challenges? And that's a question that I want to address in the rest of my remarks today. We see this as a metrics challenge. Most firms today are still relying on tools such as compliance monitoring, staff opinion surveys, analysis of customer complaints, and of course, third line internal audit results in an effort to try and get their arms around these soft and squishy problems of culture and misconduct risk. That has led to a circumstance in which many firms argue that, look, the regulators can't give us a good definition for what success looks like. The regulators aren't telling us, here's how we want you to measure culture. And as a consequence, we argue that culture is simply too soft a thing to be measured. Of course, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And if we agree that culture is what drives conduct, then implicit in that formulation is that conduct cannot be managed. And so we're in a stalemate situation without good metrics. Another problem, and this is something I'll dwell on for my next few slides, is whatever metrics we produce, they have to be informed by a real understanding of behavioral science. This is a picture of John Stumpf, who's the former CEO of Wells Fargo. He was in place when the scandal erupted publicly around the opening of false accounts at that firm. And he was interviewed on television and asked to explain, how did this happen? And his remark, I thought, was fairly noteworthy. He said, look, I don't know how to explain human behavior. And I think that's a big part of this problem around culture and conduct risk. There's a need to not only develop good quantitative and data-driven metrics that we all can agree shed light on this topic, but to do so in a way that really understands what it is that drives human behavior. And that's what I'll turn to next. Culture is typically described as sort of the way things are done around here. What I want to emphasize is that those cultural norms of an organization are unwritten rules. They're informal rules that govern behavior in the organization. And I think we've all experienced this. I think you can think anecdotally in your own life where you've had not any formal instruction that a certain behavior was required or a certain behavior was prohibited, but you just sort of picked it up in the air around you. You knew that your peers and or your superiors would unofficially sanction that behavior. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how I think we need to think about managing and measuring culture, given that informal nature of the problem. And there are three, I think, common traditional views of management science that we need to turn away from. First, the orthodox economic view of man as a rational actor seeking to maximize utility really needs to give way to the learnings of behavioral science. This is Richard Thaler, who just won the Nobel Prize in behavioral economics. I think what we've learned is that man is not necessarily a rational actor, but if anything, we're predictably irrational. And so any effort to measure culture and conduct risk has to bear that in mind. There's also a predisposition on the part of management science to focus on the individual, right? We look at individual psychology. We run surveys or tests that try to gauge the psychological profile of a particular employee before we bring them into the organization. And that sort of is an indicator of this traditional view of the individual as what matters. What we would argue at Starling is that it's not the individual that matters so much, rather it's the social context in which that individual is embedded. And then the third traditional bias that we think needs to be overcome is this mechanistic view of the organization that has prevailed since the time of Frederick Winslow Taylor, where man is seen as sort of a cog in the machine. We think that that needs to be replaced by complexity science, which in brief is a science that looks at how complex adaptive systems have emergent properties. That is to say, properties that belong to the group but that are not reducible to any individual member of the group. And we see those evolutionarily adaptive emergent qualities in things like a flock of starlings, which you've just seen on the screen here. That, by the way, is where we take our name from. We think that that's a good metaphor for how organizations function. Let me say a little bit more about how I think culture operates in an organization. In our view, culture serves to create constraints on behavior, right? The cultural norm at this organization is one where such and such behavior is simply not acceptable or is simply required. When we internalize those constraints, that then informs our character, right? And we look to hire people into the organization who already show that this is a part of their character. And then in any organization, communities of common character will come together and they'll establish cultural norms for their group, which in turn results in constraints on the behavior of those group members. And around this flywheel turns. Most of our efforts in risk governance focus on the right side of this circle and ignore the left, right? We focus on formal incentive schemes. We focus on formal systems of punishment. We focus on formal employee assessments at the individual level, and we ignore the importance of these communities and the cultures and subcultures that we create. And I think we ignore that largely because up until now, it's been very hard to really assess that stuff in any meaningful way. Something else I want to talk about is there's an evolutionary anthropologist at the University of Cambridge named Robin Dunbar. He did work back in 1992 where he looked at different primate groups, and he looked at the size of the social groups that each of those primate species maintained. And he found that there was almost a linear relationship between the size of the brain and the size of the groups that people maintained. But there was a hierarchy to those groups. We all have individual self-interest, but then the next level of concern for us is our immediate family and friends, our closest and most trusted people in our lives. And then there's a small group, slightly larger than just your family and friends, that also matters very much to you, then a larger group, then humanity as a whole, and then higher moral systems. And what he pointed to is that there's an increasing emotional distance as you move from the center of the circle out. Now, in the context of an organization, we see that innermost circle as being comprised of your most highly trusted peers, not necessarily your friends at work, not necessarily the ones you go drinking beers with on Friday after work, but the people that you would turn to in times of stress or uncertainty, and really trust that they would offer you reliable counsel, that they'd have your best interests at heart. Then you've got your team that you're formally embedded in and the management of that team. And then moving out, maybe you have the company more broadly, which is where compliance sits. So we've moved now from the first line to the second line. Then you've got at the sort of the third line, if you will, the tone from the top in the C-suite. And then out here is where the regulators sit, right? Societies and the law. And what we see is that there's a decreasing coercive force the farther out you move. And so where many regulators emphasize, oh, the tone from the top is so critical in setting the cultural agenda for the organization, we agree that the tone from the top is an important consideration. But really what matters, to borrow a term that the Monetary Authority of Singapore has very cleverly introduced into this conversation, it's the echo from the bottom that matters. And that echo from the bottom comes from your most trusted peers. So what we want to get at in the work that we do at Starling is that innermost layer of these sets of circles. What are the cultural norms among your most trusted peers as they shape your behavior predictably in the organization? And I'd like to introduce into our conversation here a concept that we've come up with that we call coercive competition. Again, if culture acts to create certain constraints on your behavior, that is to say, it works to coerce you to behave in a certain way or not to behave in a certain way, that coercive force has both formal impetus from the formal organization that you see on the left here, the y-axis. That's where the tone from the top comes. But then there's also the coercive impetus of your peers and what behavior your peers encourage. And your peers, just like the organization, will punish certain behavior and reward other behaviors. So on a simple 2x2 chart, what you get is there are certain people who act in a way that their peers would prohibit and would frown on, would punish, and the organization would also. And employees who fit in that box, we call them the rogue employees. And this is where you find your insider threats in an organization. Then there are those who will act in a way that the firm might encourage, but their individual peers might ridicule. We talk about them as the teacher's pet. I'm not sure that these names really do justice to these concepts, but as shorthand, I hope that the concept is clear using that term. Then there are those who will engage in behavior that their peers would encourage, but that the organization itself would frown upon. Those are the cool kids, right? Those are the ones you want to fit in with. You think back to your days in school, right? There's the kids that engage in behavior that maybe the teachers frowned on, but if you wanted to fit in with that group, you wanted to be one of the cool kids, then you followed the lead, the behavioral lead that your peers set for you, not necessarily the lead that the organization would have smiled upon. And then there are those model citizens who act in ways that both the organization would celebrate as well as their peer group would celebrate. So we think this is an important way of thinking about how culture shapes behavior in an organization with these competing coercive systems at play. Let me say a little bit now about how to operationalize some of these ideas. And I'll emphasize that this is not how our technology works, but it's a good illustration of the way our category of technology works. What I'm going to share with you now is a little bit of research that came out just a couple of years ago from Stanford and Berkeley. These professors looked at 5 years worth of email within an organization, and they looked at, I think it was over 10 million emails, and they looked at how people's use of language in an organization, written language in the emails, tended to converge over time. That is to say, there were behavioral norms in the use of language. And what they showed was that there were three common, what they called were enculturation trajectories, or three signatures that they were able to distill from this email data. And what you see here is that everyone, when they first join the organization, they're below the baseline. You can see the baseline there is 0. Everyone starts out a little bit below that. And then some people come into the organization, they accept the behavioral norm of the organization. They adopt that behavioral norm. That is to say, they start to mimic the behavior that the organization prefers. And they get increasingly good at it over time. The second signature that they witness is people who come into the organization, they're much farther below the baseline on day one. It takes them a couple of years to finally catch up with the norms of the organization, but they do. But they ultimately reject it and think, you know what, this is just not for me. I've sort of had enough of this. And then there's a third group of people, and we've all worked with these folks. They never get it, right? They come into the organization early on, far below the baseline. They never even reach the baseline. And what's important about these three different signatures that are, again, just distilled from patterns of language use in electronic communications is that the authors of this study were able to find that those three signatures were associated with very specific outcomes. So for those who accepted and adopted the communication norms of the organization, that is to say, those who were normatively compliant with the organization, that pattern correlated with very high predictive reliability to increased job satisfaction, greater motivation, greater discretionary effort on the part of those employees, increased tenure and attachment to the company, and a nearly 50% higher probability of such individuals being promoted. And what I think is particularly important, they also saw that there were higher levels of individual and firm performance among the people who evinced this ability to adopt the cultural norms of the organization, again, as reflected in language use and internal communications. For the second group, those with a more ambivalent cultural fit, we saw that they have the ability to adopt the norms of their peers, but they lose a willingness to do so over time. And these are often those that we refer to as your disengaged employees. They just sort of switch off. And this set of circumstance ends very predictably with voluntary exit, right? These people leave the organization. And then that third trajectory where there's very low cultural fit, that's associated with involuntary exit. About half of those people are fired. These are what Gallup calls actively disengaged employees. And the difference between passively disengaged and actively disengaged is passively disengaged employees are sort of thinking, this place isn't for me, I want to get out of here as soon as I can. Actively disengaged employees are angry. They want to harm the organization. They don't just want to leave, they want to lob a grenade through the window on their way out. And this is where we find greater increased fraud risk. And what I like to think about is how those different signatures that can be distilled from those email patterns would fit into that competitive coercion model that I described earlier. I think those who peers would chastise, who the firm would chastise, those rogue employees, those are the ones who never really fit into the organization. The model citizens are the ones who adopt the norms of the organization and excel as a consequence. And then the other pattern can fit into one of the other two boxes here. I'd put this forward as an interesting way of thinking about how you can find signals in company communications data that gives you an indication of where individuals and group of individuals would sit in this competitive coercion matrix that we've created. And I'd like to suggest that having that understanding would position you to make different management decisions about how to manage those particular people. The point I'm trying to share with you is that within electronic communications metadata are signals. And we've been able to demonstrate at Starling that those signals can be discerned and that different patterns in that data ties with predictive reliability to particular behaviors that may be of interest to an organization or of concern to an organization. Whether those behaviors are desirable and that the firm is looking to encourage those behaviors more successfully. Think, for example, of greater knowledge sharing across the 3 lines of defense. Or if those are behaviors of concern that the firm is looking to manage away. Right? So artificial intelligence informed by behavioral science can distill these digital fingerprints, as we call them, that ties with predictable reliability to behaviors that firms care about. A second concept that I'd like to leave you with in terms of how our technology works, drawing on AI and behavioral science, is that of behavioral contagion. There's stacks of social science research that demonstrate quite compellingly that behavior is contagious. And just as an epidemiological model will look for patient zero, right? They'll look to track a virus as that virus makes its way through a population, and then to project how that virus is likely to continue to spread across that organization so that limited inoculation resources can be used in a way that's more productive, more timely to anticipate where the disease is going to spread. In a very similar way, an ability to identify these digital fingerprints for behaviors of interest can be mapped onto what we call the trust graph of an organization. Behavior transfers from one peer to another, and most readily between trusted peers. So if you understand what we call the trust graph of an organization, you have an ability to project how particular behaviors are likely to permeate that organization. And again, if those are desirable behaviors, then you're positioned to encourage that with greater efficiency and effectiveness. Conversely, if that's a behavior that's of concern, you're able to intervene in a way that's proactive to mitigate the risk of that behavior. And importantly, in using data to do all of this work, you're able to evidence to the satisfaction of your risk committee on the board, to the satisfaction of regulators, that you have a new means of anticipating how behavior is likely to spread across your organization, and a new means of either encouraging that behavior or curbing that behavior, depending on whether or not it's desirable behavior. This has brought Starling to the interest of not just firms, but regulators worldwide. And what we've tried to emphasize in talks like the one we're giving today is that these trust networks are very important in considering how cultural problems permeate an organization, but they're also essential to understanding what governance solutions can be brought to bear. And we believe that they form a future of supervisory success in this context. Let me stop there. That concludes my formal remarks, but hopefully we've got some questions, and I'd welcome an opportunity to address any questions that the group would like to share.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I found your presentation quite engaging, and I do have a question of my own. Dear participants from the Monetary Authority of Singapore, Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Bank of Thailand, Bank Negara Malaysia, the Central Bank of Papua New Guinea, Central Bank of Chinese Taipei. We're delighted to have you here. If you have questions, please use the chat feature in the GoToMeeting software and send me your question. Alternatively, please send me a WhatsApp message, 601 2477 0722, and I'll direct your questions to Stephen. Stephen, my question is, I like this thing about digital fingerprint, but I'm just curious as to how would an examiner, supervisor at the Bank Negara Malaysia or the Monetary Authority of Singapore harness this kind of information to get insight on the culture and the conduct and behavior of a regulated entity?
Thanks for that question, Mark. Look, the honest answer to that question is I don't know. Again, I've never been a regulator or a bank examiner. And this is a very new category of technology that's only just recently being trialed by firms, and regulators are looking at it. So precisely how an examiner would make use of this has yet to be determined through those experiments. I, of course, have ideas about how that might be. My ideas are obviously self-serving, right? We're a business. We have something that we want to sell. Rather than just putting our own ideas out there, our approach to answering this question that you've raised for ourselves has been to go out and engage with the regulators. And one thing I'll make mention of, this will be known, of course, to those who are on the webinar who are from the Monetary Authority of Singapore, but a group of regulators earlier this year came together, about 29 of them, and formed something called the Global Financial Innovation Network, and or the GFIN, it's abbreviated. And what the GFIN seeks to do is to encourage the use of these regulatory technologies by firms, but to do so in a way that affords the regulators an opportunity to observe how these tools are being used, and critically for the regulators to then share their experiences with one another. So I think we're in a learning process, to answer your question, and I think that organizations like the GFIN are there to try and consolidate those learnings and to accelerate the adoption of these new tools, which, I mean, look, they're new, right? So anyone like me who's got this new tool to share wants to argue that it's the greatest thing ever made. But of course, those who are responsible for safeguarding the financial system are understandably a little conservative. So I think it's important that the regulators are encouraging these trials. The GFIN community opened up to applications from reg tech firms that wanted to conduct cross-border trials. That application process was opened earlier this year. They've just recently announced, I think they had about 50 applicants, and they've selected 8 companies to work with in cross-border trials. We are one of them. So I think in the course of these trials, we'll have a better answer to that question. Just to dwell on it a little bit longer, I do think that if a firm like Starling is successful in creating metrics that lots of financial institutions will use to gauge their own culture and conduct related risks, once enough firms across one given market are using the same data sets and the same analytic outputs from us or someone like us, there's an opportunity then for all of those different firms in that jurisdiction to report a similar set of analytic output up to the regulator, and for the regulator then to have sort of a view out over the culture and conduct risk that permeates the entire ecosystem. We're exploring that with some regulators in different markets.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. We have a question from one of our participants. Stephen, you mentioned the use of communication data to detect undesirable behavior. Could you give us examples of other types of data that constitute digital fingerprints? And how do you deal with clients' data governance issues?
Yeah, so those are two very good questions. Let me address them independently. So different firms in the reg tech space use different data sources to drive their analytics engine. Data is like coal that goes thrown into the steam engine of a train, right? Different engines will work with different data sources. Many firms in the reg tech space will use transactions data, for example, which is a very rich source of insights. Others like us work with communications data. In most firms today, most company communications is still conducted across email. We recognize that there's a lot of chat tools that different firms use, such as the Bloomberg chat function or Symphony. And of course, particularly here in Asia, there's a greater use of WhatsApp and chat tools on personal devices. That creates a bit of an issue, right? Because any work communications is supposed to be captured on company servers for regulatory reporting requirements. But any of those data sets, if the firm can make that data available to us, we can make use of it. Something I'd like to emphasize about the way we do our work at Starling, and this segues into the second question about data governance. Our tools work exclusively with metadata. Metadata, for those who aren't familiar with the language in this space, is things like in email it would be to, from, CC, BCC, time, size of an email, time between me writing you and you responding to me, and all of that, of course, in a non-linear fashion. We're looking at a many-to-many set of relationships. So we're not just looking at how one individual communicates with his or her peers. We're looking at how that individual communicates with their peers as compared to how most of the organization communicates and how others in the organization communicate with that individual. And when you have enough of that data, we've been able to demonstrate there are discernible patterns in the data that drive our engine in a way that allows us to create predictive insights. And what's great about the way our technology works is that we're not using text at all. We don't touch the text, we don't gather the text, we don't need the text. Therefore, we're far less of a big brother proposition, which is a concern in many organizations. We're less of an information security risk, right? Because we're not taking any sensitive information from the organization. For organizations that operate in Europe, we don't believe anywhere near the same level of GDPR-related risk. And then just logistically, it's a lot easier to scrape that minimal set of data, move it up through pipes into the cloud, run our analytics, and push the analytic insights back down. And so with the firms that we are working with today, which includes some of the largest banks in the world, very active across all of Asia, we've been able to circumvent that data governance issue by using the right sorts of data.
Okay, and so we have a couple of other questions, Steve, and I'll try and get to them, but I want to park one with Glenn, so as I don't forget that question. We want to talk about the volume of data required for this kind of analysis use. Just remember that one for me, Glenn. So we have a question here again, Stephen, from one of our online participants. What type of data do you use to summarize issues around culture of a firm, and whether or not regulators have successfully used behavioral science to identify issues of misconduct? So the first one is, what kind of data do you use to summarize culture and behavior of firms? And have regulators use behavioral science to ID misconduct?
Let me answer those in reverse, if I may. So to the question of whether or not behavioral science has been seen to be valuable for regulators, I think the answer to that is yes, and increasingly so. The Central Bank of the Netherlands, the Dutch Central Bank, really was a pioneer in this space. And the process that the DNB created for investigating culture within an organization is one that has now been mimicked by many other regulators in different jurisdictions. And the DNB has been very active in sharing its methodology with other regulators. The Central Bank of Ireland has just adopted their methodology. I know that the DNB has been very active in Australia, in Hong Kong, and in Singapore. The Dutch Central Bank, interestingly, was the first central bank in the world to actually hire PhD organizational psychologists to look into these issues. And they produced a very big book on how this methodology is done. The principal author of that book is a woman named Maria Rajmakers, a PhD in organizational psychology. She's actually an advisor to our firm. And what we're seeing is that not only are the regulators finding behavioral science interesting and developing behavioral science units internally, MAS just created one, I believe, last year, but also firms are now starting to hire their own behavioral science teams. They're creating what they call internal nudge units. And so what's great about that is there's a new take on these questions that these different behavioral science teams are bringing to bear. The challenge that we hear from all the firms is, I have 175,000 employees in 40 different countries. I've got a team of 6 behavioral scientists. How can I possibly leverage that resource across the full scale of my organization? We're working with a very large bank headquartered in the UK that has created one of these behavioral science teams, and they sit at the level of the third line. They sit within audit, and they do internal examinations within the bank using this behavioral science methodology, but they really can't scale that. And so a technology like ours allows us to support those teams in creating great scale, again, because our technology works with metadata and not text. It really doesn't matter whether the electronic communications are written in English or in Chinese or in Farsi. It's the metadata is all the same. It's all ones and zeros. So we achieve far greater scale, and we're supporting those different units.
Yeah. And a related question to that is, in terms of the data, how would a firm or even a regulator go about collecting the kind of data to guide their decisions around culture and conduct? And the one I parked with Glenn in terms of what kind of time series of data would you need? What volume of data would you need to guide those decisions as well?
Yeah, and I left unanswered your second question before about how we would then use data insights to assess a culture. So let me try to answer all 3 of those. We need, so let me do it in this order. So in terms of the data that's collected, we're not collecting anything new. We're not collecting any data at all, in fact. The data that we're working with is data that the firms themselves have already collected. It's communications data that's sitting in their servers and in their archives. The firms are maintaining that data, again, for regulatory requirement in many instances. And so the data is already there. We're just producing insights out of that data, which is an underutilized resource. In terms of how we collect the data, it's really relatively simple. We work in the cloud. We can work on premises. It's a lot more efficient to work in the cloud, and many of the firms that we talk to want to work in the cloud. And so we simply send over a little piece of software that scrapes the relevant fields off of their communication servers, and then brings that up into the cloud. That can be on our own cloud pipe. We work with Amazon Web Services, as do most of the firms. They have their own AWS pipe. So whether it's their pipe or our pipe, we bring that up into the cloud. We run our analytics on an instance in the cloud. We then destroy that instance so we don't maintain any of that data. And we push our analytic insights back down through the cloud into customized dashboards that we build for the customers. So it's really quite simple. In terms of how much of that data we need to gather and over what time period, organizations are organic, right? People come and go. So we need a certain amount of historical data to train our machine learning engine. We find that anywhere from 6 months to 18 months is sufficient. Less than 6 months, we can still do what we like to do, but our confidence levels and our analytic outputs drops. More than 18 months becomes superfluous. So it's a relatively small time scale and a relatively light lift. So that's working with firms. Now, working with regulators, that's an interesting question. We haven't actually had any regulators ask to work with us directly. We would be open to that, particularly because the regulators can simply request the data that drives our engine from the firms that they oversee. And through proper privacy concerns being managed, we can anonymize and aggregate those data sets and create a macro systemic view around culture and conduct risk in those jurisdictions.
Yeah, I think you've answered that, because there's a question around personal data protection. I think you've alluded to that question. We have a question here on what machine learning algorithms are used to arrive at insights on culture and conduct. I don't know if you want to address that one.
Yeah, these are proprietary algorithms that we develop. One thing that's interesting that's maybe worth mentioning is we're referring back to some of my earlier remarks about complexity science and complex adaptive systems. We take a very biological and almost evolutionary approach to our science here. There's a very robust field of computational biology, which is used in genetic engineering to anticipate how lots of moving parts within an organism will interact in a way that produces certain behavioral outcomes at the organism level. And that field of computational biology has now been discovered by sociologists. And in recent years, we've seen the emergence of a field called computational social science. And we are a computational social science company. So the mathematics and the science behind our technology is very robust and has been used for over 30 years in biological and medical science. We're now just bringing that same set of tools and applying it to organizations. But the specific algorithms that we develop are proprietary and developed in-house. Our chief data scientist, interestingly, was trained originally as a computational biologist. One of my co-founders was originally a genetic engineer. So there'd be no way to really describe the algorithms other than to say we've cooked it in-house.
Okay. So very often when I'm engaged in conversation around artificial intelligence and machine learning, there's a lot of question coming up around the ethics, the governance in terms of how it's. Do you have any thoughts on issues as we move more and more into the using artificial intelligence to, for example, guide how we supervise banks' culture and conduct? What are some of the ethical challenges, and any thoughts as to how we address them?
Yeah, well, we take that very seriously. They're particularly in the post-Cambridge Analytica world. There's a very legitimate concern about these very powerful technologies being misused, and our technology is one that could be misused just as much as any of the others that are out there. We don't really duck that issue. We actually take it head on. We've thought it was important in building our company to make sure that we acted in a way that regulators would smile on. We built an advisory board that includes former regulators such as Rick Ketchum, who was the CEO of FINRA in the United States, Martin Wheatley, who was the inaugural CEO of the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, and then I referenced Maria Rajmakers, formerly with the Dutch Central Bank. And so we've made sure to act in a way that they look over our shoulders and look at what we're doing, and they make sure that what we're doing is something that they think is ethical and appropriate. We also have been giving consideration to creating an ethics advisory panel, where if we're asked to do certain work that we think is ethically questionable, it could kind of go either way, that we put that to the panel, let a panel decide. But I think this field is very, very frothy, and there's lots of new players that are doing very interesting things that are subject to misuse. And so it's a field that I think honestly really cries out for its own, if not regulation, then its own sort of industry standard ethical norms, like the American Bar Association, for example, or the American Medical Association sort of sets rules for its members. I think there's a need to create something like that in the world of artificial intelligence and machine learning. I think it's coming, and we would certainly welcome that.
Glenn has been listening. I don't know if Glenn, if you have any questions of your own. I have a couple more of mine.
Yeah, I do, Mark. Thank you, and thank you, Stephen, for your presentation. My question relates to the possibility that employees of the bank or officers of the bank, once they know, that, data from their internal communications and everything are being collected, that they might then somehow alter their patterns of communications with each other.
Yep.
Just, in America, we call it the Big Brother effect. Big Brother is the television program that has a camera, observing a bunch of people living in a house. Well, nobody behaves naturally if they think that they're under observation. And if the employees of the bank or officers would know, that their email correspondences, historically are being analyzed, would that run the risk of their, simply changing their behavior in a way that's not really consistent with their real culture, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so we would talk about this. Is there risk that employees would try to game the system?
Right.
And I'd answer that in two ways. First, this data is already being collected. Again, we're not collecting anything new. Firms have already collected this data and have been collecting it for a long time. And when employees come to these organizations, they know they have no right to privacy, that they're working on their company-issued devices, and it's company-relevant data. It's not their personal data. And we've seen over and over again in things like the LIBOR fixing scandal and other scandals that people shockingly still communicate really quite freely in their emails, chat messages about behavior that they know to be wrong. So there isn't a lot of that gaming of the system already. So that's point one. But the second point is, again, we're not looking at an individual and sucking in individual data. We're looking at whole populations of individuals. And so, Glenn, while you may think, oh, if I'm being scrutinized, I'm going to change my communication habits in order to try to manipulate the system in some way. First of all, you don't know how our algorithms work, so you don't know how to manipulate it. You don't know what those different signals will do. But secondly, while you can change your behavior, communications patterns, you can't change the way everyone else in the organization communicates with you, nor can you change the way everyone communicates with everyone else. And so the overall patterns of the organization remain persistent. It's a little bit like the blockchain, right? If you're familiar with blockchain technology, part of the promise of the blockchain is it's not corruptible unless you can corrupt the entire chain, which simply is mathematically not possible. Our technology operates in the same way. So we're robust against the system being gamed.
Right. We can take one final question from our participants online. Stephen, thanks, Glenn, for that question as well. Could you share with us, Stephen, any case studies where analytics were able to identify gaps that would have otherwise gone unnoticed?
Yeah.
And what were the measures taken by management to address those gaps?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thanks to whoever asked it. I'll give you one very recent example. We've just concluded a pilot engagement with one of the largest banks in the world, a bank that has a very significant footprint here across the Asia Pacific region. And that bank came to us and they said, look, like some of the other financial institutions, we manage non-financial risk using 3 lines of defense, risk management paradigm. And this is a bank that's been subject to significant fines in recent years, and so they're under pressure from their regulators and from their shareholders to do a better job of managing these non-financial risks. And so their global head of operational risk approached us and said, wouldn't it be your view at Starling, given how you've emphasized the importance of trust and trust networks in organizations, wouldn't it be your view that our 3 lines of defense is really only as robust and resilient as the trust relationships among the different people who own risk management responsibilities within a given line and between those lines? And we said, yes, that's precisely what our view is. And they said, well, we don't really have a sense of that, right? We have a sense of who owns what risk. And we have sort of the formal organization chart of our 3 lines of defense structure. And so we have some basic understandings of how we think people will interact in order to make sure that risk events are sufficiently elevated across the three lines of defense and successfully mitigated, whether it's at the first line level or second line level or what have you. But the functioning of all that really depends entirely on the trust relationships among the risk owners within the three lines of defense. Can you map that out for us? And using your technology, which we did. And then after doing so, they said, well, that's really interesting. So that gives us a lot of questions around how this person is interacting with this person, or how that group is interacting with this group, and whether these second line resources that are sitting in Asia but looking out over our US wholesale bank, are they operating in the way that we would expect? These are all questions that they have been asking themselves, but they haven't had a means of being able to peer into that. And we've created that means for them. We call it a three lines of defense gap analysis. That's been a very, very successful engagement with that particular financial institution. They have actively shared the work that we've done with them, with their regulators in the US, in the UK, here in Asia, and those regulators have found those analytic insights to be of interest.
Thank you very much. Sadly, I could sit here for the entire afternoon, listen to you present on this topic, Stephen, but we're out of time. I have to ask you one kind favor before we close. For the name of the book you referenced from the Dutch Central Bank and the name of the author as well. I think our participants will find that useful. We can take note of it and we'll share it with our members as well. But certainly I found the session delightful. If you could give us a parting shot, closing comments, what would be the key takeaway for us as regulators looking at culture and conduct and behavior of banks?
Yeah, that's a great question. If I were to leave you with one thought, it would be this. There's long been the belief that culture is a sort of soft and squishy topic, and one that doesn't lend itself to good metrics, which makes it very difficult to govern internally within firms and to supervise externally. I would encourage those who are listening in to look at that differently. That may have been true in the past, but new technologies now make this possible in ways that were not possible previously. Firms won't adopt these technologies unless they believe that it creates value for them internally, but also they want to believe that their regulators will smile on that. So I think there's a real opportunity for regulators to engage with firms that are trialing these tools, and we'd encourage that collaborative, almost ecosystem approach to this.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much all for participating. Just stay online for a minute. I'll get the name of the book from Stephen and I'll put it within the chat room and I'll post it there. Stephen will mute his mic as we do this. Thank you very much.